Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you, Arya, Eric. Good to see you. Make sure to take a moment, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're about 100 subscribers away from hitting 8,000, which is a good milestone considering we've been doing this for almost a year now on YouTube. Our guest today, folks, I'm sure should know, but is Max Isle, author of A People's Green New Deal, associate editor with Agrarian South Journal, which is fantastic academic journal. I really encourage everybody should be reading all of the stuff that they do. This piece today is with Middle East Critique, which is another excellent journal, and the piece is titled Palestine and the Ends of Theory. Max is also a researcher with the Marian Center for Advanced Studies in Maghreb, Tunisia, and the University of Ghent. We've had numerous conversations before. This is an excellent piece. I encourage everybody to download it and read it. It is open source. So without further ado, let's get into it. Max, it's good to be with you today.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. So you start your piece with October 7th, and then, you kind of move into the now 12 months really that we've witnessed, and you're analyzing really kind of the lack of engagement within most academic or intellectual circles, including many that are quite critical of Israel, as you note. So you're examining it even within what we would think of as an anti-Zionist kind of theory camp. So their lack of engagement with Hamas in particular, but also other Palestinian resistance factions and other, anti-systemic, regional forces, national liberation forces in the region, right? So in part the axis of resistance. So you write the lack of engagement around Palestinian and axis of resistance military strategy and Israeli counterinsurgency. And then this part is a quote, politics is therefore effectively excised as a historical category, leaving the humanitarian case genocide. So can you just start by laying out some of the reasons why this is such an important error that's being made in your view, and what's lost in failing to take these forces, their politics, and their military strategies seriously? And you'll have to unmute yourself because I muted you. Sorry.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think there are fundamentally at least two issues at stake, right? One is that there is a struggle for public opinion in Western capitalist democracies, right? And not only, but particularly that's who is first of all absorbing the type of thought that I criticize in the piece. So there's a struggle for public opinion, and therefore there's a struggle over the shaping of public opinion, what that public opinion will look like and how it will act upon history. And in particular, basic level, will it act or not act to cut off arms exports and pressure and decidedly rupture with the Democratic Party, or happen, but force from within the Democratic Party through these various campaigns. I think they're a dead end, and I think.
Uh-oh, your audio is cutting out a little bit. Let's see. Let me see if I can. All right, sorry. So you were talking about how you think that the struggle within the Democratic Party is a dead end. Let's try again there.
Yeah, or if not actively malicious, for example, with redirections engineered by Walid Shahid, for example. But so if there is a struggle, right, for shifting public opinion, you want to be able to explain clearly what's going on, and you have to seize remaking again the case for the ethical and moral and political case for your side. You've actually crippled yourself from the outset if you say we are not going to engage with Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, Iran, if we're going to accept the either the dismissal, the denigration, if we're going to accept outright opposition to these forces, if we're going to accept empirically false arguments about what they've done, why is someone going to support your cause, right? It's, in the same way, for example, that something very basic, right? The incubator story that was used, casus belli against Saddam Hussein, that was used to lubricate public opinion, right? So we have to empirically, of course, it's necessary to challenge the lies about these movements, which also means simply telling the truth about them and the whole truth, including how they have been affected by imperialism, how this distorts them, and so forth, right? So just actually telling a lot of the burden of the article is simply telling the truth about them, including the fact that according to the United Nations, they're engaging in legal struggle for national liberation, including the use of their sovereignty to extend support to other forces that are fighting for sovereignty and against colonial settlement of Palestinian land, right? So the point is that if we don't engage with these forces, if we're just like, what Israel is doing is bad, then Israel's apologists shoot back at us. They say, okay, but Hamas is also bad. And we're like, well, we're not here to discuss Hamas. Or who said to support Palestine is to support Hamas? I mean, so there's a basic issue that you're actually running your war for public opinion in the West on very poor grounds, ultimately. That's part of it. And a second part is, of course, that what support, relatedly, I mean, what support campaign for a national liberation movement in modern history has proceeded by accepting that you should have nothing to do, even at the level of expressing any form of sympathy for that national liberation movement itself, right? I mean, that is enervating, that is a demobilizing, that is a deactivating discourse for political work in the Western imperialist court. Yes, yes, we want to support these abstract, deracinated human beings who are these kind of objects of sympathy, but as they act politically, well, we want nothing to do with that. I mean, no one ever supported the ANC on that basis. No one ever supported the Sandinistas on that basis, or supported Nicaragua on the basis of rejecting the Sandinistas, right? It would be absolutely ridiculous to abstain from any form of engagement with these forces in the main, right? And of course, you see that I run through some people who in fact have done that. And I think what's worth noting is that in fact, they proceed on the basis of lies and fabrication, or just racist implications against the movements that are actually absorbed in what posits itself as anti-systemic thought, right? Which I think is very ridiculous. There's also another issue, which is also very concrete, which is that in fact, first of all, not everyone takes a distance from these forces. I mean, no one is in any formal relationship with them, of course, but not everyone is willing to accept that these are demons, right? In fact, people support them as part of an organic component of the Palestinian and broader Arab and Iranian pro-national sovereignty or pro-national liberation movement. We can get into how I think it's important to distinguish between these terms. If necessary, right? But just to be precise. Now, the point is that then those groups can be easily targeted as extremists, and therefore you are actually opening up vulnerabilities amongst that portion of the people involved in this political work, right? Which tends to be the Arab or Iranian or portions of the Muslim community. I mean, portions of the Muslim community are, of course, like any large religious community, are like the degenerate right-wingers who support imperialism. But a lot of it is also in favor, at some level or another, of these of the national liberation struggle. And so you're actually being complicit in the deactivation, the intimidation, the enervation of often what is the fundamental organic basis of support for, say, anti-Zionism or anti-imperialism in the Arab-Iranian region, and those who are struggling around those geographies in the imperial core, right? And then there's finally, the upshot of that finally is that the US is aware that even in the 80s, there were substantial sums of money that went from the Palestinian exile community to support, for example, the PFLP, right? It was totally legal then. The terror lists, the so-called, the Oslo lists, the Oslo process and the accompanying terror lists, which were signed into written law after a presidential directive, I think in 95 or 96, then were written law in 1997, make any material support illegal, right? Now, all sorts of, this in fact, it creates further breaches and separations between the people who are actually fighting for their lives and dignity in the Arab-Iranian region and people here, right? And we have long been calling for campaigns to lift these terror lists, which are actually not even used to persecute people who are directly supporting these movements. In fact, the most notorious case of rancid political persecution against the Palestinian community in the recent times is that of the Holy Land Five. These men were donating to the same zakat committees, charity committees, that USAID had in the past donated to, and they were convicted essentially on the basis of secret evidence, according to the Patriot Act, right? This was just a blow to the well-being of the Palestinian community in historical Palestine itself, right? By cutting off this kind of flow of support. So again, we do not accept the persecution and prosecution of political activity, right? I mean, that is something that should be actively resisted in the imperial core. And if you say, okay, well, Hamas is terrible, or I don't want to mention Hamas, but somehow I'm going to support a campaign to try to lift the terror listing of Hamas, there's an incongruous position, right? And so people really need to understand that. And of course, it's also there's a lot of capital that goes into maintaining these incongruities, right? It's not just a coincidence that people arrive at these kind of internally inconsistent positions.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's definitely not a coincidence. And I know that you lay out a lot of the different kind of terrain of how we got here, in this piece. And so one of the aspects of the kind of theoretical landscape that is available in Western discussions of Palestine, or a couple of the aspects that you talk about, are apartheid, this framing of apartheid, and settler colonial theory, as it is often sort of taken up in the academy. And so, can you share some of your critiques of the limitations of how these discourses or concepts have been deployed with regard to Palestine? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
I just want to set the stage. We can circle back to this larger point, but the context for how these theories are constructed is, of course, anti-national liberation politics the capitalist capture of a lot of Western left intellectual production, racism within Western left intellectual production, Islamophobia within Western left intellectual production, and Zionism within Western left intellectual production. So I want to be clear that my critique of these categories is situated in the fact that it was an uphill struggle to kind of fight for these categories to have a place in the overall critical apparatus, right? People had to fight to be allowed to say Zionism is apartheid. People had to fight and still fight now to say that Zionism is a form of settler colonialism, right? That's still an ongoing fight. But just because something is a fight doesn't mean that that such a discourse that we're fighting to be able to use freely is itself necessarily free of defects, right? So people will, because it's a fight, it becomes easy to say, oh, well, we're talking about Palestine using these categories. This is radical in its very nature. And if it's radical in its very nature, you've actually walled it off from a form of critique, and then capital and liberalism can worm their way in, right? Can worm their way in once you've said, okay, we're not going to actually examine what's going on in the construction of these categories in the Western academy or why they're circulating, right? And so I think this is very important. So for settler colonialism, I've written about it a lot, actually, and it's something I noticed as soon as it was circulated now almost 12 years ago. Patrick Wolf's work started to be very much circulated in Palestine studies. And of course, it was an advance to be able to say that Zionism is a settler colonial project. But at the same time, as the editors of the special issue of settler colonial studies argued, they said the point is that it must advance beyond sentiment, that is, Zionism is bad. It must inform strategy somehow, that it must inform a national liberation struggle or a national sovereignty struggle, right? And that in turn means, okay, if you have a strategy, you need a reading of the material landscape. Now, the problem is that settler colonialism, as it was elaborated in the Western Academy, became shorn of a materialist analysis of the imperialist landscape and also of Israel's relationships with imperialism, and kind of became a category of sentiment and informed a strategy of defeatism, right? And it was very much, when settler colonialism was first being elaborated as a category, it was often, although not always, linked to the national liberation movements and their political horizons, right? I don't want to say that this was automatic. For example, Maxime Rodinson was a two-stater, right? And he was his book about settler colonialism is very well known. Not a bad book, but again, there isn't a mechanical translation from theory to analysis. But, settler colonialism was also a fundamental category that shaped how the national liberation movements in Cabral was talking about settler colonialism, right? I discuss that a lot more in this thing, something that's under review for Agrarian South. I mean, the Patnaics talk about the distinction between colonies of conquest and colonies of settlement. Kanafani didn't quite use the term, I don't think he used the exact term settler colonialism, but he talked about the process of a settler colonization of Palestine by the Zionists. Now, the difference is that when they talked about that, I mean, Cabral explicitly was actually, his analysis was very Orthodox Leninism. And you can see it in Revolution in Guinea, People's Struggle. It's a very Orthodox Leninist analysis, right? And the Patnaics are certainly not Orthodox Leninists in terms of their problematization of Lenin, and Kanafani was not at all. I mean, he was also adopting a lot of Maoism, but furthermore, he was saying, okay, there's a Zionist apparatus that is linked to a global set of institutions that support the Zionist project, that is linked also to capitalism, that is a capitalist practice carried out, a colonial capitalist practice, that itself is linked to Arab reaction, that it's also furthermore linked to the capitalist classes in Palestine, and that is furthermore linked to world imperialism. So the PFLP asked this kind of very classic question, derived from Maoism: who are the friends of the Palestinian Revolution, and who are the enemies, and how can we differentiate between the two at different historical stages of the struggle, right? And that requires actually a materialist analysis of the relationship of imperialism and settler colonialism, and both of them to capitalism, to understand who are your allies and who are your enemies at a determinate historical moment, right? And so that is how Kanafani elaborated it. And that actually was very much dominant in a lot of Maoist-influenced third world thought in the late 1960s and 1970s, which was really the high noon of the national liberation struggles on a world scale. I mean, and this isn't to say that they themselves were immune from all sorts of the travails and catastrophes and besieging that they suffered during post-socialist construction or national developmentalism in a world capitalist system. But the point is that they had this informing their analysis. Now, Patrick Wolf, who got very popular, including in leftist spaces, I think, and I wrote about this in an earlier article from a year ago from Middle East Critique, basically elaborated this analysis of settler colonialism as this kind of self-activating process of land engorgement and elimination. Now, this had two fundamental problems, right? I mean, one, he basically removed settler colonialism from its imperialist backstop. Right, that he removed the idea. He said, okay, settler colonialism in Palestine is very similar to settler colonialism in America and Australia. And, there are similarities, but there's very, very important differences. One of them differences is that America, which is an imperialist and settler colonial project, is actually the main funder and enabler, and I basically think master of Israel. Right. This is one thing. This is a very important difference. The political tasks of militants in the U.S. would accordingly be very different. Right. I mean, there are campaigns that to cut off the arms supplies to Israel. That looks very different. Those campaigns to resist Israeli settler colonialism look very different. That's one thing. So in removing it from imperialism, he made it not only did he make settler colonialism very palatable to a wide range of people who then would transport it as this category, as something practiced by China, as something practiced by the USSR. I mean, and this was explicit. Wolf said, I want to make settler colonialism a category that precedes whether or not a regime is communist or capitalist. Okay. I mean, and then it was also divorcing it from Palestine, from its kind of traditional sister struggles, for example, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Nigeria, which, according to the classic analysis, these were settler colonies. These were places where Europeans came and alienated land from the indigenous population, right? Now, for Wolf, of course, they were colonies with settlers rather than settler colonies. This is not a distinction I care to elaborate on because it's not a serious thing, he said. But we should only read it by its effects, which were to say, okay, we should no longer understand Palestine as one of the uncompleted national liberation struggles. Instead, it becomes a cousin of the very the national struggles for decolonization that are facing a very uphill battle against huge demographic majorities, for example, in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia. And as he said, for Australia, this is basically waged, their struggle is waged at the level of ideology, and it's against assimilation, right? And he said basically the relative balance of force no longer applies, which is another way of saying that the armed component of the struggle is no longer relevant, right? Now, this, of course, has huge problems that barely need to be elaborated upon, right? I mean, first of all, it should be clear that Wolf actually was defending community control, the Indigenous Peoples Campaigns for Community Control in Australia, he kind of lifted them up in his original study, but those kind of dropped out of the analysis, right? And by the end of it, you find him in something, 2007, I don't know, something like that, and some volume for Edward Said, basically saying that magically Palestinians and Israelis will live in a democratic capitalist republic. I mean, which is whatever. Sure, that might be better than being genocided. Like, no one could say otherwise. But there was no path for it in any event, and it wasn't the political horizon, right, of a lot of the historical Palestinian struggle, which is for liberation and return. And that's how claims of class historically, this is a point Andy Carnell made, this is historically, and Maria has also written about this. I mean, there were claims about what the material redistribution in a liberated Palestine, right? And that's kind of inheres or coheres in the classic claim for liberation and return. I mean, there's a claim for return and restitution of properties, right? It's actually very mainstream in historical Palestinian thought, right? It was never a fight for liberal democracy, right? Now, so this you know, and in the process, I mean, he basically, as he passed, you know, he had nothing to say about the various modalities of Palestinian resistance except for BDS. Now, we all support sanctioning Israel, but do you see the BDS campaign being very prominent over the last year? No, not at all, right? Now, it's probably a topic for another show, how the BNC campaign really became a tool of counterinsurgency, was demonizing Samidun, was demonizing any solidarity formations that chose to verbally support an armed struggle in Palestine and so forth, right? And you know, even BNC staffer called within our lifetime one of the most very important Palestinian formation in New York, called them saboteurs. Right now, I'm sorry, like any formation that's doing this is actually engaging in wrecker work, right? That person, how can the person show their face, right? Ziad Lunat. Now, so you see the way this develops, right? Now, it's very similar, I think, in many ways with apartheid, right? I mean, apartheid even became popular, and this is something Mohammed Masraoui, as a Palestinian PhD student in Germany, it was explaining to me, he's like, Max, like, apartheid is actually a popular category of analysis in Israel amongst the Israeli left, right? Because first of all, it conduces to similar aims, right? But second of all, it reduces it reduces or sidesteps the fact that there's a military occupation that is prosecuted with guns. This is not a question of labor reserves that are maintained through a kind of armed police force. This is a military occupation enforced with gunships and Apaches, and that induced a militarized resistance to it, right? And again, you know, there's this sanitized version of the struggle against apartheid, which totally omits the role of the frontline states, which actually were critical for the collapse of the apartheid entity in South Africa. And that furthermore, the lever of withholding labor, which could be active in South Africa, doesn't exist in Palestine. So the struggle is going to look different. Finally, there's one point which I got a little too interior when I was discussing Patrick Wolf, right? But the regional component, the question, what's classically understood as Arab strategic depth, which is now Arab-Iranian strategic depth, does not exist in these discourses as they circulate in the Western Academy, right? It's not there. It's simply not present. It's not present in the historical sociologies. It's not present in the Marxist studies. It's not present in the discussion about international law. It's not present in the work that is discussing either settler colonialism or apartheid, even though this is, in fact, the national movements are operating in a fixed a geopolitics that affects what they can and cannot do, right? Syria is having weapons manufacturing plants, small ones, for supplying weapons to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is very clearly part of the support front for the Palestinian armed resistance. I mean, these are not even, of course, we're in sympathy with these people, but this is not even, one doesn't have to have a normative position to discuss reality, right? It's in fact the discussion of reality that's been placed under a kind of intellectual, academic, and disciplinary quarantine. That you can't discuss reality. You can't, and it's kind of left to IR and also counterinsurgency and even Zionists, academics, to discuss reality. And also you can, sometimes they have some decent studies. I think I cite one or two of them where they point out that, Hezbollah had adopted elements of the People's War strategy and so forth. There's a reality. There's a reality that Iran, they say these forces are Iranian proxies. First, none of them are Iranian proxies, but Iran is the geopolitical, logistical, and technological backbone for Hezbollah and for Syria and for Palestine. They have transferred a lot of technology, I believe, to Yemen, although Yemen is to some extent its own case. I mean, that was, they have been growing in strength without, I think, any Iranian support really, other than at the ideological level, since the early 2000s, the Saddam Wars, where they fought many wars against the Ali Abdullah Saleh regime, a neo-colonial regime throughout the 2000s until they were marched into Sana'a and took state power. So all of this it just can't be discussed, right? And people are, first of all, people are robbed of an understanding of what's going on in the world. And intellectuals are reluctant to engage with it, in part, like I said, because there's already sanctions for, historically, there were sanctions against even engaging Palestine on the intellectual level. I actually do not think that's the case anymore. I think this is sort of a taboo thing to say, but it's not the case anymore. I'm sorry. But the result is that people don't work on these issues. I mean, it is shocking, right, that there are barely any recent studies of Hamas. I mean, it is shocking that there are just 2 studies of Islamic Jihad, one of them in French, and then Eric Scare's work, which is very good, even though Verso titled his Hamas book in a very stupid way, typically. There's one study, and it's at best half decent, of Ansar Allah, right? Most of us probably get our information about Ansar Allah from Rune Eigerhouse's Twitter feed, right? Like, that's like the #1 source to get information about Ansar Allah, right? Unless you're kind of following closely the Arabic production, which. So there's actually a gap in our basic knowledge of what these forces are doing. I mean, there's basic gaps in our knowledge about how Hamas functions, how there's a lot of internal debate about tactics, about strategy, about orientation. Will it pursue a peaceful path as it did until it was holding its kind of armed in abeyance throughout the Great March of Return, seeing if that could work. The amount of crippling injuries, amputation, permanent disabilities that resulted from that kind of wash of death in the face of a nonviolent mobilization, the wash of death poured upon it by Israel, convinced a lot of people in Hamas that the nonviolent option wouldn't work, right? I mean, and I think we would benefit from this because we would understand them better, right? I mean, I participated in nonviolent mobilizations also in the Gaza Strip in 2010, where I discussed before in your feed where we saw people die. And of course, when that happens, people are going to normally, it's very normal, you would lose faith in those modes of resistance because you see them not working and you see your enemy is prospering, right? And I think as a movement, people would better understand the situation we're in. And I also think academics also are in the position where they need people. No, academics are pushed and pulled by social pressures and institutional pressures. And, you see that every time an academic does something that sticks their head way far above the parapet, it gets like cut off, like what happened to Russell Rickford at Cornell, for example, and others. And, I think in part this is because there's so few of them who are willing to say these things in the Western Academy, but it's understandable that there are few willing to say these things in the Western Academy. And so the point is to kind of, if you want to shift what people can even research, let alone what they think or what they feel comfortable saying and so forth, people have to be better informed about what's going on, basically. And so this is kind of what I'm pushing for. I mean, I'm not an empirical investigator of Palestine. I do empirical historical work on Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt to some extent, and not really on Palestine. I keep track of things. But people should feel not only encouraged, but they should feel that there is a support system for them to just do honest academic work about it. It's not a question of that can then be a source of education for people engaged in political work.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we should say a little bit about what that support structure looks like. What are some publications, journals, where you think that folks can do strong empirical work on Palestine? And you made that comment about you don't really think there's a sanction anymore. But there are obviously journals that won't allow these viewpoints or will kind of censor them out, and you talk about that a little bit in the article as well as in some of your work.
Right. I mean, I don't think there's a sanction on intellectual production about Palestine. In fact, you see, in fact, like vampire academics will just mention Palestine, even if it's not their main thing, but they know they should mention it before they go on to talk about whatever. And it becomes kind of another radical epaulette that they can put on their shoulder. But in terms of, I think what is demonized is especially the honest discussion about the real nature of, because we see some honesty about Hamas as kind of seeps out. I mean, actually, Hamas, we're going to have to deal with this background noise. I'm sorry. Hamas is actually relatively well studied compared to these other ones, right? Compared to all the various other forces I'm referring to. But if you're looking for honest inquiry about Syria, you won't find it. There's a complete intellectual quarantine, for example, around the work of Ali Qadri and Linda Matar. No one will discuss their work. Right? Matteo Capasso, who wrote a great book about Libya, he is maligned as a Gaddafi apologist for writing a good book about Libya that explains how people felt about Gaddafi in Libya, right? So there are these quarantines and blacklists that operate generally in the shadows, but not always in the shadows. And then you see, contrary-wise, you see active demonization of these forces within progressive media, progressive journals, by progressive intellectuals and so forth, a lot of which I go into in the piece with receipts. I mean, the receipts I provided are very partial, in fact. There's a lot more. But, I think people need to collectively identify it and say, look, this is what you've produced here is propaganda, right? It is a propagandistic approach that we cannot discuss freely the Islamic Republic of Iran unless we're willing to adopt a stance of denunciation. Like, this is ridiculous. This is not how we approach things in social sciences, right? And this is not how we approach things in the political world. I mean, this is not, people are a lot more forgiving of the peccadillos of, Sean Fain or Ocasio-Cortez than they are of states that are under siege and sanction, right? So I think people need to be aware of these things, and they can decide if they tolerate them or not. I mean, I go into it in the article, but for example, it still is allowed to get printed in New Left Review that there's a campist approach to Iran. Well, there's a war, right? There's a war. So if you want to carry the metaphor as opposed to the 1 camp, 2 camp, 3 camp, Soviet, Trotskyist nostalgia, that world doesn't exist anymore. So what we're really talking about is the fact that, these academics are ignoring the fact that there is a war, right? If there's a war, there's the enemy camp and there's your camp. So what camp are you in? Michael Hart or whoever wrote that, Sancho Mazarja or whatever, right? What camp are you in, bro? Like, are you in the camp of the war makers? Are you in the camp where there's a state which has many internal contradictions, which no serious scholar and no serious no serious communist would ever deny that there's political contradictions, some of them acute in that state, but the state is being targeted because of its support for Palestine. And you are actually stating that it is basically a campist approach to clearly articulate that fact, or that it's, unless you sign on to the regime change agenda by calling that state a regime, right? Or for that matter, unless you adopt the frankly bigoted Orientalist perspective that there are wars amongst the faithful, right? I'm taking this from Perry Anderson's 2015 article. I mean, is he demented, right? Is he actually senile? Maybe, but this is a demented perspective, right? That there's a state of primordial sectarian enmity in the Arab-Iranian region, that this is why there is a struggle and that many of the forces opposed by imperialism for historical reasons happen to be Shia. And many of the forces, but not all of the ones that imperialism supports, are Sunni, right? I mean, Tunisia is 99.99% Sunni, and Yemen is incredibly popular here. The Yemenis are Zaydi, which is a kind of branch of Shia Islam that's more or less not that far from Sunni doctrine, but this is not my field. Nevertheless, are Shia. So what is this primordial battle against the faithful? No, this is all this is essentially the post-1970, but even more post-1979 weaponization by capitalism and imperialism of conservative branches of Sunni Islam in order to first contain the left, right? And this is the historical activation of the right-wing portions of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Palestine, right? We're actually, and also in the diasporas, to beat up leftist activists and so forth. I mean, it happened until the 2000s at the university. I mean, my friends talk about it, right? What happened to them in Ujet and so forth in the Tunisian university system, right? Although the Nahda has a more complicated story too, which we can briefly talk about if we want another time. But be that as it may, right? They actually had their engagement of radicalization. Nahda is a Sunni force in Tunisia, and they were actually activated partially by the 1979 Shia revolution in Iran. It was in danger of spreading across the historical sectarian separation, right? Now, nevertheless, this kind of state of so-called primordial enmity between these forces is actually the fruit of an imperialist and neo-colonial capitalist operation in order to prevent a kind of consolidation of cross-sect popular opposition to the U.S. agenda in the region, right? And so it's just presented as a conflict amongst the faithful, right? I mean, this is just stupid, right? And this is the leading journal, what these little guys love to call the leading journal of the left, the flagship journal of the left. It's just saying racist stupidities, right? That's all it is. It's not like something we need to have a dignified approach to. I mean, the guy Anderson calls Hamas. It says people are ruled by bigots in Gaza. What the fuck, man? Like, this is an outrageous thing. This is an outrageous thing to have put in print, right? And so, this is when I was talking earlier, when I prefaced my critique of apartheid and settler colonialism by stating that, there's still a lot of Zionism or Islamophobia or racism within the left. I mean, like I said, I don't think there are exact sanctions on writing on Palestine in the academy, although there's still racial allocation of who gets to publish, for example, right? I mean, London Review of Books does not allow Palestinians to publish, right? Libcom, which is Zionist, but even if they allow anti-Zionists, they have Ilan Pape, they don't allow Palestinians to publish, right? This is racism, right? Even if, I have criticisms of, there are criticisms of what Palestinians do and don't publish. If you're not even platforming Palestinians, you're racist, sure. It's very clear, right? Like, why aren't you? It's really weird. You could even find ones who fully agree with you. Like, you don't even have the sense to cover yourself. Now, so we have to keep in mind that there's a lot of Zionism, right? And there was this infamous interlude with Andreas Malm and Anselm Japp. Andreas Malm, there's a lot to disagree with him about, but, Anselm Japp was being platformed at Red May. Would we platform a white supremacist who had a great Marxist analysis at any, in any Marxist platform? Would even these journals, maybe they would. Yeah, I know. They're half of them are having flirtations with right-wing nationalism, but not an overt one, I think. And if there was a counter campaign, it would cause a big problem, right? So again, it's very shocking, right? There is this kind of enduring tolerance or countenancing of Zionism or Zionists, if not Zionism, within the Western left. You're like, oh, okay, that guy's really, he's not. He has some problems, but he's valuable on this other thing. Enzo Traverso also, right? Very famous historian of the left. I mean, and he's a soft Zionist. I mean, it's very clear if you read him, right? He's obsessed with this idea of Jewish exceptionalism, the loss of Jewish modernity, and then finally he refers to, how Zionism, in particular in its current form of the Netanyahu government, must be opposed or should be the subject of opprobrium. Well, not 1948. I mean, under Ben Gurion also, there's no difference, right? I mean, it should be the subject of opprobrium from the jump, right? From 1882. Right. So again, this tolerance for Zionism amongst the Western left was actually a tolerance for the political formation of colonialism and also a specific allocation of rights and privileges and development and underdevelopment, which is also another way of saying it's a support for the political structuring of capitalism. This is allowed still in the Western left. So this is kind of the background against which the criticisms, and I do have criticisms of the way this apartheid literature, so a lot of the apartheid and settler colonialism literature develops, right, and is deployed, right? So I think we have to keep it all in mind as we understand how to situate ourselves in the intellectual landscape.
Yeah, thank you. So there's another, one thing I want to go back to for a minute. So you make a point about genocide, right? And the lack of engagement also with, I think what you're saying is there's a lack of engagement with Israeli counterinsurgency strategy as well, that also, becomes somewhat of a problem for people in terms of their organizing and how they orient it. And if I mischaracterize that, please correct me.
No, for sure. I mean, from the outset, right? It was, from the outset of this war, because of the demonization of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and PFLP that kind of was the background against which discussion occurred, and therefore the background against which people were interpreting the day-to-day reality. People said, okay, they're not targeting Hamas, they're targeting the people. I mean, first of all, they are targeting Hamas, but they're also targeting the people because the people are the sea in which Hamas and Jihad and PFLP swim, right? The same way the people are the sea in which Hezbollah swims, right? This is a very orthodox understanding of how guerrilla movements operate, right? And, you know, the risk of depoliticization is that it fails to understand that Israel, first of all, Israel may have been willing to tolerate a pacified Gaza. Now, it also very much would also like to just not ever have to worry about the problem again if the domestic costs are not that high, right? The problem of managing Palestinian populations in Gaza and the West Bank. That's definitely an option for the Zionists. But in any event, the conjunctural activation of the genocidal counterinsurgency was Palestinians acting to resist the settler colonial order, right? That was the activation point for a counterinsurgency campaign that becomes genocidal in its very nature. That to some extent you can always target if you're a colonial force carrying out a counterinsurgency. One, you can partially target guerrillas, right? We have no idea how successful they are. Some guerrillas have certainly been targeted, right? Have been targeted successfully. It's in the nature of things. This is warfare. And then, okay, if you have some idea that there are guerrillas in a certain place, if you've dehumanized the underlying population, then to say that there's something uniquely evil about the Israelis for targeting the population instead of the guerrillas, it just sidesteps the fact that the guerrillas are just regular people themselves, right? They are trainers, and they're nurses, or they're taxi drivers, or they're people who were unemployed and didn't have a chance to partake. And there are people who are, and Mary Terfa had a beautiful piece about this, there are people who are defending and willing to die and dying for the right of their loved ones to have a future, right? And the flip side of that is if you kill enough loved ones of the guerrilla, who are they fighting for? Then their future has been shattered into fragments and ground to dust, right? So there is no future, right? Because the future are the people you live it with, or who you imagine will be inhabiting that future. So if that's destroyed, then you're actually also targeting not only the guerrillas' capacity for provision, but also their will. You're sapping their will to fight itself, right? This is what Mary pointed out. And so again, like, this is all, I wouldn't quite say it's deliberate, but these are the predictable outcomes of what happens when you totally shear off the political facet of Palestinian armed resistance from the existence of a Palestinian people and their day-to-day life and the suffering they undergo at the hands of the Israeli state, right? And so I think we're divorced we're barred from an adequate understanding of reality when this is the case. I mean, we just can't understand adequately what's going on when what we're presented with is a humanitarian horror that escalates to genocide because of the quantity of people that are killed. That's all very true. And if people will only oppose it on that basis, that's much better than them not opposing it at all. But it's better still if they have an understanding that this is politics, which is about the creation, which is about a struggle over a path to the future, right? And that's how we engage in a political discussion collaboratively. And that's how we understand our own reality if we want to change it.
Appreciated. I do want to talk about, especially with what's going on in Lebanon today and over the last week, especially, although obviously it's been a very hot support front for all of the last 12 months. But, certainly there's a marked escalation, as well as the pager and walkie-talkie explosions, which are just a open act of, state terror. Um, so you mentioned recently that it's important to be clear on what occurred with the proxy war in Syria. So walk us through some of your reflections on, thinking about what you and others cite as a failure to understand Syria correctly, and the implications that this has with the war on Lebanon now too.
You know, um, I mean, very briefly, and I understood this because I had a good teacher, the same way most of us understand certain things, who's actually Yoshi Furuhashi, who used to edit the monthly review blog. I want to thank her. I would like to thank her. Helped me see, because she was also publishing stuff from the Syrian left. She was publishing stuff from like Indian communists who were not marinated in the Western propaganda, that it was very clear, even by March, April, May 2011, that there had been the legitimate grievances people had about both political persecution, repression, economic inequality, underdevelopment in Syria, had led to a dual track of on the one hand, mobilizations that pretty much from the outset were acquiring a sectarian edge, which is why in the early maps of the mobilizations, you see them basically stopping like a wall when they hit Alawi and Christian communities, right? So they were overwhelmingly Sunni, right? And there were some sectarian chants even at the very beginning. And then simultaneous with that were armed attacks widespread across the country from March to May 2011. And then June and onwards, of course, armed attacks against civilian installations or against, armed barracks, against police forces, against fuel tankers, against buses, and so forth. When this is happening, this informs how I see U.S. Adventurism sometimes too. When this is happening, this is someone's escalating, trying to militarize a situation to try to justify pouring in weapons and justify the push to violence. And then the more violence becomes rational amongst people who had not before then picked up arms, because certainly Syrians themselves came to pick up arms, right, in the face of an ever more violent tableau in front of them. The violence is fed externally with salaries, with weapons, also with many foreign fighters, right, but also ends up dividing the Syrians themselves. Right, and then the country gets burnt down because no government is allowing itself to fall in the face of an externally armed force that is carrying a different flag. No country will do that, and and the right of opposition force to change the social order does not follow on the precepts that people like to circulate. It's right to rebel. It matters what you're rebelling for. You need to have a banner for an inclusive project, both to gather people behind your own banners, right? But also, if you want the support of foreign leftists, you should have an emancipatory project that gathers their support. Being oppressed is not a sufficient grounds for asking for the support of the left, right? Now, some people would call that narrative Assadist, unfortunately. Some maybe more wouldn't these days. Then everyone called that narrative Assadist. And actually that narrative was more and more cast as Assadist in late 2011, 2012, when the so-called Free Syrian Army was activated. The weapons started flowing in masse from Turkey. Jabhat al-Nusra was founded, and so forth, and the country descended into a full-scale war, right? As we know now, the U.S. was on the border with Turkey. It was directing the flow of weapons into the so-called moderate militia rebels, right? There's some narrative that it was blocking anti-aircraft weapons, like it didn't allow in anti-aircraft weapons in general. Some did go in, but it didn't allow them in because that would have escalated the Iranian and Hezbollah intercessions on behalf of the government. It would have changed the rules of the game, the same way Israel doesn't just nuke Hezbollah right now, right? There's rules of the game in a conflict that lead to certain forms of escalation, right? Or that prevent certain forms of escalation. So in any event, right, I mean, it was very clear that the US was engaged in an agenda of mass destabilization and damaging of the developmental level of Syria. The goal at a certain point was not really to overthrow the government. It was actually just to substantively weaken the government to such the point that it would be primarily preoccupied with trying to assure some kind of minimum level of social reproduction, trying to assure a minimum level of security, even to achieve territorial sovereignty and so forth, right? This is what actually happened in Syria. And we tweeted about it, we wrote about it at the time, and it was clear what was happening. But people said, okay, to put this out as Assadist. If you want to clarify what's going on, you're an Assadist. You're an Assadist unless you're calling for the downfall of the government. We were like, well, what's going to replace the government? Why are we in the United States destined or entitled to decide who gets to rule Syria, right? And in fact, the forces that would take over the government are to the right of the government itself, right? So, in fact, they are not only economically and culturally and socially reactionary, and they would support imperialism. So, on what basis should we support it? Like, if you want to call us Assadist, we're not going to budge. Our position is that we're going to accurately describe reality, right? Now, what's significant, right, are two things. One, I mean, is the disciplining operation that went on, right? Which you see whenever there's a flashpoint in the Western left. You see kind of ink clouds and disciplinary operations precisely because that's an imperial flashpoint where the class struggle is condensing in one form or another in a very sharp way. So you see these flashpoints. Now people are more accustomed to understanding that these are flashpoints, I think. But you saw flashpoints in Syria. You saw it earlier in the 2000s in Zimbabwe. The question of sanctions was explosive, right? And the question of the legitimacy of the agrarian reform. By 2011, it was very clear that there was a radical agrarian reform, right? But actually, you can find Patrick Bond in 2007 supporting. He called the sanctions illusory, right? Patrick Bond, who gets published in Monthly Review, right? So this is kind of, there's a process through which the forces that are either one fighting to maintain their state support for anti-Zionist militia in the case of Syria and Hezbollah, or forces fighting for a redistribution and progressive change in the social structure, as in the war veterans and others, the unemployed slum dwellers, and the presidency in Zimbabwe, right, are demonized, and then you can't even discuss it anymore. You become Mugabeist, you become Assadist, you become Gaddafi apologist, you become Hamas neck, whatever, right? And it actually precludes an analysis of the overall situation so that people can become informed in Western civil society and act upon their understanding of reality. Now, the disciplining operation was very important, and it was also in full force, in the whole spectrum of the Western left. So your position on Syria became the issue, right? And I published Patrick Hagan's outstanding piece in Jacobin, holds up very well in 2015. This kind of set in motion a chain of events where it was demanded upon me by Sebastian Bojanet Verso, basically conveyed a demand to the editor that we publish a regime change perspective. And I was like, this is crazy. We're not going to publish something that's wrong. And it also became a major issue at Viewpoint magazine, where they pushed me off, although they don't exist anymore, and so forth, right? So this became really a major issue, right? Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter? It doesn't just matter for how we understand how intellectual disciplining happens in the Western left, which is very significant. It matters because what is going on right now in the Arab-Iranian region? You have a front that is not open because people are starving, right? Syria had a relatively functional, strong army until 2011. It was forced to fight probably hundreds of thousands of foreign mercenaries, right? 100 internal fronts. And under the threat of, because of the penurious impact of the Caesar sanctions, which are some of the most severe sanctions ever applied to a state in history, the government cannot restore the developmental level. They have trouble getting food tenders on international markets. People are literally starving, right? Whereas the developmental level has been set back 60, 70 years, right? Syria is in chaos. So instead of being a support front for Hezbollah, it's actually just in chaos, right? And it's actually bombed all the time by Israel, right? I mean, Russia has some culpability there too, we can be clear. But, Syria is devastated and it's incapable of being part of the support front for the project of stopping the genocide in Gaza, right? It cannot do that because there's nothing that can stop that genocide except for armed force. The Western movements have a role to play, a support role, and hopefully can get stronger. But the main obstacles are in the region themselves, right? And Syria is not part really of that obstacle, although it plays an important role in terms of a rear base for Hezbollah. Arms convoys regularly pass through, are landed at the airports there and make their way over the border into Lebanon. There's also, like I was discussing earlier, there's arms production facilities and so forth. So it's a significant part, even in its debilitated state. It's still important, but the situation would be quite different had that war failed. Had that war really failed, had that war been prevented from happening in the cradle. And that war was a Western war. And so people would prefer to say that anyone who says that is an apologist for the genocide, when in reality, if the Western intervention hadn't happened, there would have been some type of really humanly tragic crackdown, and it would have avoided hundreds of thousands and the development of the entire country, right? And people don't want to contend with that or contend with the fact that the overall strategic landscape is much more dour than it would have been otherwise, precisely because of that war. And that's why the war was fought, and that's why the sanctions regime is contained. I mean, it is continued. I mean, the sanctions would not be in place if the government changed its position, changed its foreign policy. Very simple, right? It's very clear. In fact, an offer like that was just made to Ansar Allah, I think, 5 days ago. You know, they said, if you stop your actions in the Red Sea in support of Palestine, then we will recognize you, I believe. Right. So that's the geopolitics at work, and if that isn't acknowledged, frankly, how are people supposed to maneuver? Right. Contrary-wise, Syria then becomes a lever to distort people's entire understanding of imperialism and anti-imperialism, right? Because if anyone's talking seriously about what is the U.S. agenda in the Arab region, you have to have an accurate understanding of Syria, then you're a sadist. So, okay, we don't have an accurate understanding of the U.S. agenda in the Arab region, right? Or, I mean, I don't say we, I'm speaking loosely, like lots of us do, but it's not very widespread. I think nearly as much as it should be. I mean, people, instead, you have this kind of metastatic brain cancer where people are thinking that we're in the Arab region, the US is in the Arab region because of the Israel lobby, right? Instead of the Arab region being a critical place to kind of destroy the combativity of labor on a world scale, to induce fear, disorganization, hopelessness, desperation amongst the regional and global working class, to burn up super reservoirs of labor so that you reduce the cost of the reproduction of labor on a world scale. It's not understood as a kind of central testing grounds for arms. It's not understood as a central laboratory for techniques of counterinsurgency and counter-repression, both through the warfare, through the kind of theater warfare that's going on, but also in the West Bank and Gaza, where that technology is then sold to like Modi's India. It was even sold to Lula, messy on foreign policy, to be clear, also in Haiti. It's sold all over to repressive regimes worldwide, and Israel's historical role in the world system is this kind of gyro of counterinsurgency, and also the sale of counterinsurgency technology. It's also a very important node in the kind of U.S. high-tech incubator and network and so forth. It also probably serves to a wide range of money smuggling and money laundering can obviously happen on a wide scale through Israel, but it also kind of induces destabilization in this entire region. Also ends up burning up a lot of Arab and Iranian resources and surpluses in the service of defensive armoring, rather than moving to a kind of more autonomous form of industrialization. It also maintains all these refugees as being skilled labor, and in fact, kind of war-induced brain drain to Europe. I mean, that happened to Syrian doctors. First of all, you have Syrian laborers who are reducing the overall combativity of labor in Germany and elsewhere. Palestinians too. Lots of people from Gaza have made their way over there. But you have a loss of unskilled labor. And you also have a loss of skilled labor. Right. So the amount of Syrian, but also I should say Tunisian and Algerian doctors in France and Germany, right? It's actually a massive subsidy to what's left of European social democracy, right? So it's working in both ways. I mean, and it's allowing for the kind of reproduction of the European labor force at a lower cost to European capital. So it's part and parcel, actually, of the war against the European working classes themselves, who don't see it often, right? Some do. Some don't, although really it should be stated that the German popular position in Palestine is not nearly as bad as the government. It's not great, but the government and the media classes and the academic class are far more reactionary even than the German working class. And I'm taking like the extreme example, right? And it's similar elsewhere. Now, so this is actually, this kind of flow of social labor that's crystallized in training is part and parcel of the whole imperialist apparatus, right? And also, of course, Germany was a major supplier of Dolphin potentially nuclear-equipped submarines. Israel was a major purchaser for the German military industrial plants and so forth, right? So in all these ways, right, Israel is very central, and it's not just Israel. Right? I mean, of course, Israel, by instilling this state of defeat, ensures that the entire kind of Arab West, which are kind of larger population centers, then become labor reservoirs, exporters, subcontractors, skilled sources for brain drain to Europe and to the benefit of European capital. Whereas in the East, you have a whole different set of dynamics. You have dynamics that are basically built around, on the one hand, preventing a kind of integration of the region with Iran, and on the other, ensuring that all the capital flows end up either that the whole political and financial and trade architecture ends up mostly integrated with the West as much as possible, not only in terms of the fact that oil continues to be priced in dollars, that the sovereign wealth funds continue to be invested in Western treasuries and so forth, but also that you disorganize people, including the popular classes in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia is really the major one, and ensuring that they don't end up aligned with an anti-systemic project, right? Because you kind of are sowing sectarianism, and Israel plays its role in that as well. So you have all of these dynamics, right, that are part and parcel of that, of course, is blocking the kind of idea of an alternative horizon, which is strong states that are committed to development, that is the fulfillment of production and development of people's capacity to fulfill themselves, and also kind of the use of social resources for that development, infrastructure, schools, and so forth, especially the idea of a state as a mediator for popular class interests, and the idea of a state as a sect incubator and seminary for a development project and a political project and political subjectivity. All of that is denied by U.S. imperialism, with Israel as a central cog in the larger kind of juggernaut, right? And so all of that you can't find. Like Andreas Malm, I mean, his positions are fine, but I'll say it on the show that he's a goofy dude. And what did he say in his last article? He was like, some of his positions are fine, to be clear. I mean, he has brave positions on certain things. I respect him for that, not much else. And he says, oh, we seem to have ignored writing about the relationship of how U.S. imperialism works in the Arab-Iranian region. Maybe it seemed a little campist. I'm just like, you guys are the major sponsors, and all of your various publishing enterprises are the major sponsors and setters of research agenda on the Western left over the last 20 years. Like, you guys are the ones who messed this up, right? You guys completely screwed it up, and you don't even propagate correct analysis, right? So it's hard to find. Who on the Western left knows who is Ali Qadri, right? Not enough people, right? But his books have been out in English for 10 years, and his articles open access for 12, right? Making clear what the dynamics are. Why isn't he widely reviewed, right? Like, why don't people know what's going on? It's because people are prevented from knowing what's going on. This is a big issue because we can't act on history if we don't know what's going on.
Appreciated. Just a note for our audience, I recently touched base with Ali again. We did one episode, many months ago, and we're going to do another one soon. For folks who don't know, he's from Lebanon, and so obviously a lot going on. But he's in China now. But anyways, shout out to Ali Qadri, and absolutely people should read him. I appreciate you putting me on to his work, Max. Because like you say, it's not something that you're going to find promoted within any of the typical channels that we have on the Western left. I know you got to go in a couple minutes. Apologies to audience members that we didn't get to all your questions, but I did want to ask you something about that you kind of call for at the end, which is, you call for, quote, a Catholic theoretical practice that reconsiders theories explicitly aligned with the liberation agenda and its historical agents. So obviously you've laid out some of what that means, but, maybe just in some to kind of close with that.
Sure. I mean, that part is kind of specifically directed mostly at academics, but also at anyone who considers themselves a knowledge producer, because I think we all have a lot of access both to empirical material and also capacity to synthesize it. So, but what is kind of really modestly being suggested there is that people take this up and look into it. And if they're PhD students, or if they're not, if they're non-PhD students, collectively try and figure out what's going on and build up an empirical knowledge of what's going on, or carry out empirical research about what's going on. Don't be shy about it. Don't be intimidated. And do it in a way that it takes these struggles on their own terms, right? Rather than saying, okay, I'm going to clear my throat with 14 quadrillion demonizations, and every single interpretation I'm going to take is going to make sure that I could still get a seat on a roundtable on CNN. I mean, I feel that's how knowledge production about the Middle East works. Like Helen Lackner has an absurd piece on Ansar Allah, who she insists on calling the Houthis, in Jacobin. And, it's larded with demonization of them, and doesn't dare to say one word about the fact that they are trying to stop genocide, right? So, I think we have to, de-interiorize these kind of blacklists that many people end up carrying when it comes to these forces, because writing about them is complicated and could even be costly. And I wouldn't want to lie and say it's not costly for people to do that who are in positions of institutional knowledge production. Sure, it may be, but it's got to be done, right? Because it's our job as researchers and educators to create knowledge and to share it with people so that everyone can understand what's going on, especially people who don't have the privilege to be in the position of doing research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it seems to me, just to connect it to a broader point line of discussion that we've had a lot on this platform, which is this about counterinsurgency, which is, fundamentally, counterinsurgency sort of hinges on the absolute demonization of the actual forces that are resisting, right? And so, if you demonize them all, then, you know, then you can talk about other things that are not as much of a threat to the status quo within, a whole range of ways. And so, that process of demonization, when people participate in it, it is actually, supporting the overall process of counterinsurgency against, the Palestinian resistance, against national liberation. And so, yeah, Max, appreciate your time. As always, look forward to future conversations with
But
you as
I'm,
well.
I'm happy if there's like two questions. I don't,
Sure.
I know people like had questions and would
Yeah,
want
yeah.
them answered. I'll try and answer two quickly.
Cool. Let me pull up a couple. So one was, the war of position we're in the West in terms of public relations, and when will the conditions be for a war of maneuver, was one of the questions that was asked. And then another one was, I'll just ask both so you can kind of take them up together. But another one was your thoughts on the limits of Edward Said's position within academia during his lifetime. He was targeted, but he also referred to the U.S. Academy as akin to an intellectual utopia. Still, his impression that his engagement with the forces of resistance during his lifetime was light years beyond what the left liberal radical theorizing peddled by the left academics today. So those were the two things that I captured that folks were asking about.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I think Said was a good example of the fact the penalties imposed on a lot of anti-Zionist scholarship, such that to have a nationalist position, say a centralist nationalist position, became very difficult, right? And could acquire a radical edge. I don't think we can equate the moment he was in to the current moment, right? If someone had the same line as Edward Said now, then they could merit clearer critique. And I think then he was in a more, upholding anti-Zionism, was a much stronger and had a much more radical edge at that moment and cost a lot more. Now, I think what was permitted in some ways was the anti-Marxism, right? And of course, lots of people in the New York organizers in the Palestinian community and kind of intellectuals more engaged with developmentalism and Marxism, and also, of course, third world Marxists themselves, like Aishiz Ahmad and Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, had very strong, who became a liberal regime changer, had very strong criticisms of Edward Said in his time, and were very critical of Bashar al-Dumani. Also was very critical of Edward Said's approach, which I think ultimately Edward Said called for he ended up generally thinking that the Israel lobby was the cause of the problem, and that kind of racist, self-activating racist attitudes amongst Western public opinion were a large part of the problem, and that a better educated population might be able to push the U.S. foreign policy onto a better course. I mean, and he had various really contradictory positions over the course of his life. But I believe that, so I believe he occupied a kind of complicated position in that sense, with both lights and shadows. That's kind of my overall position. I mean, I don't know that we could. There was one portion that escaped me and that I wanted to say, which is that he opposed the U.S. wars, right? I mean, he opposed the U.S. wars on Iraq. He opposed U.S. I don't agree with his analysis of U.S. imperialism, but he opposed it, right? Which, as the questioner asked, that's a lot clearer than you can say about contemporary intellectuals who are just like, whatever. Let's be more internationalist, but without naming any of the wars the U.S. is prosecuting.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
The other question, I don't know. I don't live in America. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know either. I hope that we can get there, but I think it's important to continue to engage in every way that we can. Where whatever people have available to them in terms of organizing, as well as spaces where they can, as you say, I mean, this is a call to tell the truth, right? And I think that's an important part of this as well. So, Max, again, appreciated very much. Had a great conversation, and again, we'll be in touch again. Definitely encourage, again, folks, read the piece. There's a good bit that we didn't get into in terms of, there's some great context too about the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of prominence of Iran, as well as the kind of the shift of forces, which we didn't get to talk about as much, in terms of how Muslims came to take a more prominent role also in the liberation struggles in the region. So anyways, very much appreciated, Max. Have a good one.
Thank you.